Welcome, everyone. As you're coming on, please share in the chat where you're from and what you do, who you work for. Introduce yourself. We'd love to know who's joining us today, and we'll start in just a couple minutes. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you. Please continue to introduce yourself in the chat. Love seeing everyone represented from all over the U.S. It's just so exciting to see you guys here. Thanks for joining us today, taking time out of your busy Thursday afternoon. My name is Lacey Hensley. I'm the director of the Institute for Coordinated Community Response, ICCR. We are a program of the Conference on Crimes Against Women. And joining me is my co-partner, Maya Prajin. Maya is our program manager, joining today, helping moderate. So we hopefully you've seen an ICCR webinar before. If not, just a little bit about us. We are a technical assistance provider through the Office of Violence Against Women that comes alongside rural communities and helping them with their systemic and collaborative response to domestic violence. We not only do the monthly webinars, but if you want to check out our website, we have some great on-demand courses as well, including roll call training, which we have one featuring stalking with our Jennifer today, our presenter today with Spark, that we'd love for you to check out. And then we also have our monthly webinars along with a Beyond the Bounds, a newer conference to us that we're doing every fall in South Padre Island in Texas that is geared towards rural communities. So love for you to check some of those opportunities out. So today, without further ado, we're going to hand it over to our longtime friend, Jennifer Landhuis, the director of Spark, and she's going to talk to us about stalking in rural communities. So Jennifer, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks
for being here.
Yeah. Lacey, would you mind bringing up one of the first polls that we have for folks asking about what discipline they're in, or if they've heard Spark before? I can't remember which poll we put first, but let's start it off by asking, just real quick, just so that I have a good insight, how many of you have attended Spark trainings before? So the first one's choices, I've attended a bunch of them. I've attended a training or two, but it's been a little while. And the last of you asking, what is Spark? Which I will answer in just a second. And then the second one is on our disciplines, just so that I have a good idea of who's on, so we can make sure that we're targeting our conversation to those of you who are on with us today. So see people still answering a little bit, but so it looks like okay, so more often that folks have not heard of Spark before, but several of you have. You've also some folks who have attended numerous trainings, so I'll call on you for all your insight and knowledge. Please feel free to populate the chat with all the right answers. And then as we're looking at discipline, not surprising, lots of you are community-based advocates or systems-based advocates, but a good representation from law enforcement who's on with us today. So thank you for that. And then if you marked other, if you put it in the chat for us, that would be super helpful. So hopefully you're all able to see my screen right now, and we're going to go ahead and start diving into our content. So what we want to start off with talking about, and first I need to give my little disclaimer that SPARC, which stands for the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women to provide training and technical assistance on the issue of stalking all across the country. So if you are a current or potential OVW grantee, which if you're on this webinar, I'm going to guess you're at least a potential grantee, you are able to request training and technical assistance from Spark for free. You can check that out and ways to access training and technical assistance on our website, which is stalkingawareness.org. I'm going to highlight some of the resources that we're going to talk about today by pushing you to the website. So if you want to jot the website name down, if you haven't heard of Spark before, that's great. And also wanted to acknowledge that we're doing this webinar this month because January is Stalking Awareness Month. So we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end of our time together today, but also want to really make sure that I am as responsive as possible to the questions that you all have. So if you would put your questions in the chat, you'll see that the Q&A has been disabled just so it's easier for me to follow along in the chat. But if you have specific questions, be sure to put them in the chat and I'll try to make sure that I see them as they're going through. I also have a couple of my colleagues, including Julia, who is our resource and training specialist, and she's going to be linking some of the resources that I talk about today as they come up. So thank you all so much for joining us. Before we get too far into our material today, one of the things that I want to highlight for all of you and start asking questions about is the prevalence rates of stalking. And when we do training across the country, what we often find from the people that we're working with is that people will say, well, you know, I appreciate the training on stalking, Jennifer, but we just don't really see as many stalking cases as we see cases of domestic violence and sexual assault. And I'm always a little bit curious about that because the prevalence rates would tell us that the rates of stalking are just as high, if not higher, than the rates of domestic violence and sexual assault. The other thing that we oftentimes struggle to kind of have the same definition about is the definition of stalking itself. Now, clearly, you all have a criminal definition. Every state has a criminal definition and code regarding stalking, but we're going to talk about the behavioral definition of stalking today that you see on your screen. So we're really focusing in on a pattern of behavior that is directed at a specific person. But knowing that in stalking cases, we oftentimes see stalkers who are also targeting other family members, the victim or survivor's employer, people that are in the victim's sphere of influence. So keep in mind that while stalking is oftentimes targeted at one particular person, we certainly see it spill out to others, and we also see the effects of stalking on other members of family, loved ones, etc. So keeping that in mind, as well as we're going to talk a little bit about the impact on individuals who experience stalking. Now, you'll hear me use the word survivor and victim interchangeably today. I know there has been a lot of push in our field to really use the word survivor, which I absolutely agree with. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is lots of individuals who experience stalking never experience an end to their victimization. The stalking continues for the rest of their life. Those individuals are usually poignant in their comments where they'll say things like, I really hate it when people say that I'm sorry the stalking happened to you, because it's not past tense. It's always happening to me. And so we oftentimes will also use the word victim interchangeably. So I just want to give a little caveat to that language as we go forward. But as we're looking at the impact on our victims and survivors, keeping in mind that some state statutes have a fear threshold where we have to demonstrate that a victim felt fear of this particular behavior. Others have an emotional distress threshold. And we know that oftentimes when survivors are first making contact with us, when they're walking into an advocacy agency, when they're working with a police department, what they might not express at first is that feeling of fear, but rather they're expressing things like frustration, anger, even apathy. That you might hear things like, well, I don't even know why I'm bothering to tell you because it's not like you're going to help me anyway, or nobody will believe me with what's going on. So keep in mind that those feelings of anger and frustration are also emotional distress and are oftentimes masking the feeling of fear. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go forward. But as I said, when we talked about the prevalence rates of stalking, how many of you would say that you have an even caseload for the number of stalking survivors that you see in comparison to domestic violence and sexual assault? Most of you are probably going to say you see more DV and sexual assault survivors, but anybody have like an even caseload or even a higher caseload for stalking? Okay, folks saying they see more stalking. Lots of folks saying not even close. um, Others saying, okay, even or more. Yep. So it kind of sometimes depends on where you're situated, whether you're an advocate, if you're in a community that has a college, et cetera. One of the things I want to really challenge you to be thinking about is if you're one of those folks who said, nope, we don't see as many stalking cases as we see domestic violence and sexual assault, is that if the prevalence rates hold true, we should be seeing just as many victims of stalking as we are seeing victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. But for lots of people and lots of agencies, we aren't. And so how do we change that? And why do we think that is? I have some thoughts, but I'd also love to hear from all of you as we go forward as well. The other thing I want you to be thinking about is if you're somebody who said, I have an equal number of stalking survivors or even higher number than domestic violence or sexual assault, what's the relationship between the victim and the offender? I'm going to guess many of you have high caseloads of stalking, have high caseloads of domestic violence or intimate partner stalking. And again, if you look at the prevalence rates, in stalking cases, about half are committed by current or former intimate partners. The other half are committed by acquaintances, which causes us to start thinking about how are we screening survivors in and out of our agencies. And I say that, and it might be easy for me to pose a question like this. If there is a survivor who walks out to their vehicle and the tires are slashed, and they make a call to law enforcement, would the law enforcement in your jurisdiction even be able to respond to a call for slashed tires? Would it be a phone-only report? Would it be just talking to the dispatcher and making a log, an incident report of it? Would somebody be able to come out and take a report, depending on how large your jurisdiction is, how many deputies or officers they have on at that particular moment in time? And for those of you that are like, hey, does this person who's talking about rural areas even understand rural areas? I did all of my direct services in Nebraska. I was born in Iowa, and now I live in the frontier state of Idaho. So I see your role and I raise you the issue of frontier. So definitely know what it's like when we have difficulty with responses based on the availability of folks we have to respond. So lots of folks in the chat saying, well, maybe police report, maybe they'll be able to take a report when they respond. It might be a phone only report. So if that person reports that their tires have been slashed and an officer goes out and the officer says, well, do you know who might have done this? And the victim says, well, actually, there was this creepy person that just started at my work and they asked me out and I turned them down. And I think it's probably that person. Would the responding law enforcement officer think, is this the first incident in a course of conduct or pattern of behavior that's directed at this person? And do I have the beginning of a stalking case? Or would that person be like, the person who asked you out, what do you mean? Would contact even be made with the alleged offender? Would the victim want contact to be made? And when that report was taken, would it be thought of as a stalking crime? Probably not without at least other basis to move it forward. And what would happen to that report if it was a property crime? Would it be seen by individuals who might have more experience investigating these cases? Crimes against persons detectives, family detectives, and seasoned investigators within your rural law enforcement agencies? Or would it be chalked up as a property crime? And then when the second thing happens 3 weeks from now, and the victim goes out to their vehicle and there's a card or a message on their top of their vehicle, and they call it in, depending on how that first report was documented, what happens next? In lots of jurisdictions across the country, many of these cases are funneled through a crimes against persons division, a domestic violence division. But if it's not committed by a current or former intimate partner, would it get flagged and given to the right person? Because we have a lot of advocates on with us. Advocates are usually really great at saying, oh, but we would absolutely serve victims of stalking. If your agency is called Family Crisis Center, If somebody calls for shelter in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. and gets a hold of the volunteer who's never had training on stalking and says, hey, I really need a safe place to stay because my neighbor's bugging me, would the person who answers the hotline identify that this might be a potential stalking case and offer services like shelter, or shelter only available to victims of domestic violence in your area? See where I'm going? So let's talk a little bit about this, right? And definitely not pointing fingers, believe me. I've been doing this work for a really long time, almost 30 years now, and it can be really difficult to try to build these particular cases. So as we look at them, I want to also focus on what issues do being in a rural area or providing services or working on these cases in a rural area create that might be different than areas that might have more access. And so one of the things that we want to talk about is what we consider to be like the 4 barriers in rural jurisdictions. And those are the 4 A's: the availability of resources, of services, of people who are on call to respond to issues, the accessibility. Is it easy to get to? Is it affordable? Is it in a place that offers some privacy and confidentiality? Or does everybody know whose car is at the courthouse or know whose house the police department responded to in your jurisdiction? How acceptable is it to get services, to talk about stalking, to go forward in a case like this? And how affordable is it for all of these things? So those issues, particularly in rural areas, can cause some difficulties when it comes to stalking cases. And I know because a lot of you are working in rural areas, I really would encourage all of you to be sharing some of the creative ways that you've overcome some of these issues as I go through them, because I don't have all the answers. You are all very smart, brilliant people who are doing really hard work in rural areas. And I'd love for you to share with your colleagues who are on this call some of your thoughts as well. So let's dive more into the availability idea. So the things I want you to be thinking about is what happens in your jurisdiction if a stalking crime happens, or if a stalking victim is seeking services, or if we're looking to hold a stalking offender accountable. How long are the response times? Here in my lovely state of Idaho, we have some counties that to get from one side of the county to the other is a 45-minute code response. Lights and sirens takes 45 minutes to get from one side of the county to the other. And if the mountain pass is closed because of snow, you don't get to the other side. So what do response times look like for folks? How often are offices having staff there to be able to do things? We hear from lots of rural areas where, CPS, child services, health and welfare, et cetera, are staffed maybe once a week in their rural area. And those limited services often result in people saying, what resources? Like the closest shelter, the closest counseling agency is 3 counties over. So if you don't have transportation, probably not accessible. And then what comes with a lot of that is very heavy caseloads for those of us who are working in those particular areas. And so thinking about the availability of those resources and how do we overcome some of those particular situations? Yes, I see some folks in the chat saying, it's 45 minutes to an hour and a half, depending on what gets called into a particular law enforcement agency. Others are saying, it's really hard when folks are contacting law enforcement and others to build these cases. And we're going to talk about some really great ways that we can work on that. When we think about overcoming that lack of community resources, how many of you have some unique partnerships that you can share in the chat? Partnerships with things like faith communities or culturally specific agencies. I always laugh because in a lot of rural areas, people say, well, we don't have culturally specific agencies, but I bet you have movers and shakers of certain religions, certain ethnic and racial populations, the LGBTQ community, et cetera. Are you building relationships with those folks? Anybody have any unique partnerships that they want to share in the chat? Yeah, so somebody said the Mexican consulate, excellent one. Other examples? Libraries, absolutely. Really great places to access resources, including Wi-Fi, right? Other folks talking about, beautician or hairdresser schools, bars and restaurants, the tribal programs in your area. Absolutely. Those of us that are working in rural areas know that creating those partnerships is really important, right? I love that somebody's also saying pregnancy resource centers, some of the crisis lines. Ooh, I love the equine therapy that Ben just put in the chat. So thank you for sharing that one. So really trying to overcome one of those barriers in rural areas of trying to figure out what do our unique partnerships look like, because of the stigma that might be associated with these particular crimes and accessing resources in these areas. So other folks are mentioning some of the unique partnerships they have with hotels and airlines to be able to relocate victims. Some really creative ideas, and I love it. So I hope you're all taking note. I feel like every time I facilitate a webinar like this, I also learn about some really great partnerships. So keep on sharing those. Our second A is accessibility. So geographic accessibility. How do you get there? Number one, because there is no bus service, there's no taxi cab, there's no Uber or Lyft. I would also encourage you to be thinking about what are the perceptions or perhaps misperceptions about the community services that are available in your area. I'll give you an example. When I was doing advocacy in a rural area, one of the things that we offered was a support group for individuals who experience domestic violence or sexual assault or stalking. And one of the things that we did was market our support group as a parenting group. And many of the controlling offenders in our jurisdiction were more than happy to send their partner to parenting group because they were a terrible parent, where they ended up coming and it was actually a support group. And they were provided with things like diapers and resources for their children. So it came off across as a parenting group, was actually a support group for individuals who are experiencing violence. I also want to encourage you to think about what kind of bureaucracy do we end up creating intentionally or unintentionally for people who want to access services? What does it look like to be able to get a food box, to be able to go into temporary housing? Do I have to retell my story a bazillion times? And especially in stalking situations, that's not likely going to be safe. It's not a trauma-informed approach. I'm curious how many of you have had specific staff training on stalking. All of us, a lot of times, have internal in-service training, but how often are you doing training regarding stalking? I can tell you I was an advocate for almost 5 years before I had training on stalking. And when I did get it, it was lumped in with other domestic violence training. And we're going to talk about why that often happens. Some folks are also talking about, what if the offender is law enforcement or related with to others. Bobby, one of the things I would encourage you to do is get on Spark's website. We have a officer involved stalking webinar that's coming up that we're doing in conjunction with the Law Enforcement Training and Technical Assistance Center. Other folks are saying their training is focused on webinars, mostly when it comes to stalking, et cetera. And that difficulty that comes with rural areas and the lack of anonymity and confidentiality that happens because everybody's in everybody else's business. And what does that look like? So when we're trying to look at some of the solutions to accessibility issues, trying to think creatively about sources of transportation. What does that look like? Is it gas cards? Is it a group of volunteers that volunteer to provide transportation for survivors? Do you have satellite locations in areas that make it a little bit more accessible for people to access services? I know a lot of people end up having like a satellite office or office hours in something like a library or a health clinic, someplace where people have an excuse to be able to go and a legitimate reason to be able to go. Sounds like many of you have some really great solutions for some creative housing options as far as, motels go or transporting survivors to other areas, et cetera. And then the acceptability piece of things, which I think is probably one of the hardest things to overcome in rural areas, where you are often associating some level of stigma or shame and blame with accessing services. And how are we, quote unquote, marketing our services to our community? I saw somebody ask about the parenting group in the chat, and how did we market that? We marketed it as a parenting group, and oftentimes, folks that would come would end up having issues with domestic violence. We would certainly start the conversation talking about parenting, because parenting's hard if you're also experiencing violence. But then we oftentimes had folks continue to come because they found other resources in the programming that was done at our crisis center. We marketed that with CPS, with health and welfare, et cetera. But also thinking about, as this acceptability goes, what kind of reputation does your agency have within the community? And I know that those of you who are law enforcement are like, what do you mean reputation? What's the narrative? If I call the police, they're going to do what? Because there's a narrative in your community about that. So how do we work to change that? How are we putting forward information about these particular crimes, and the fact that as law enforcement, we take them seriously, that we consider them crimes, that we're going to look at accountability? How are we dealing with confidentiality concerns? One of the things that I always bring up to folks are how you keep your statistics. In a lot of rural areas, people will say, oh, we provided 7 nights of shelter this month. And then they're like, to, one family with 6 kids and one family with 3 kids. In a rural community, you might be giving away who you're providing shelter to by saying things like, well, with one family that had 3 kids, et cetera. Or when you're trying to describe a situation and everybody knows who you're talking about, even though nobody's saying names, right? The politics of providing services and the mantra, especially in rural areas, of we don't need people in our business. We don't need to talk about our problems, that everything's fine. People who are talking about, survivors who are being stalked as having mental health issues, and the stigma of coming forward to get assistance. How are we easing that pathway to assistance in some of these rural areas? I'd encourage some of you to put in the chat some of your ideas about the way that you're engaging, or for lack of a better term, marketing what you do. How are you trying to get the word out? And as you're doing that, I want you to think specifically about the issue of stalking. All the time, we have domestic violence and sexual assault victim service agencies, or law enforcement agencies, et cetera, who are telling us we absolutely work with victims of stalking. And then when I look at their victim services page, or I look at their website for the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Center, stalking isn't mentioned anywhere on that site. So how are victims supposed to know that you provide services? In the day and age when everybody's Googling for looking things up, it's not going to show up for them as a resource unless you're naming it somewhere on your site. And how are we also taking a good look internally? Whenever I do a training or in a jurisdiction, people always want to pull me to the side during the break and say things like, well, Jennifer, the real issue is that, law enforcement just isn't taking survivors seriously. And then later in the day, law enforcement is pulling us aside and saying the issue is we can't get victim advocates to work with the victims that we're working with, or they won't work with victims of stalking. And it's really easy to point fingers at the people in your jurisdiction and say, well, that other agency is the problem, without taking a good hard look at what you're doing in your own internal agency. And this became very real for me early on in my career, when I was frustrated at the lack of response to stalking in our community and had to take a step back to be like, our agency was called Crisis Center for Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. So if I'm a stalking victim and I haven't been sexually assaulted, and I'm not being stalked by a current or former intimate partner, how would I know that that was a place I could have accessed services? I have like a lot of folks calling out their relationships with some of the other community partners, like humane societies or folks who are working with animals, et cetera. Really, some really great partnerships there as well. And then last but not least, okay, Good. Somebody said I just Googled stalking in West Virginia to see where my agency showed up. Good call. And I'm going to give you a couple of other resources. I think Julia will link in the chat for us. We actually have a document that talks about, okay, if you say you work with all victims of crime or all victims of some type of gender-based violence, here's a checklist to go through and see if you actually do. So one of the things I would encourage you, especially like law enforcement on the call, many of you probably have packets of information that you have to give out to victims of domestic violence when you go on a call, usually because that's mandated by state statutes and part of your victim's rights. But do you have a packet of information that you give victims of stalking? Do you have that same ability to be able to identify stalking on calls for service? How much training did your police academy have on stalking? And don't lie to me, because I've looked at all the police academy curricula across the US. We know what's there and what's not there, okay? And the other thing that we need to delve into then is, so you take those issues in rural areas, of which all of you have some really amazing ideas to overcome some of those issues. And then let's really focus in on the stalking element and really trying to figure out, are we going beyond the stereotypical definition of what stalking is to really identify these cases as they're coming across our desk? Because they're there and they're coming in. And the issue might be that it's victims who don't identify that they're being stalked, but the issue might also be that it's us as responders who are identifying the stalking. So one of the things that we would encourage you to be thinking about then is, how are you building that response systemically, not individually? One of the things that we always talk about, especially in rural areas, is a lot of people really have a coordinated response that they're working on, whether that's a formal coordinated response or it's a we get together to talk about these cases type of coordinated response, which oftentimes happens in rural areas. But how do we ensure that that response is still going to be in place if our champion leaves? What happens if the detective that's really great at identifying these cases and responding on these cases, who's your go-to, suddenly decides to take a job in a bigger jurisdiction where they're paid more money? Or what if the handshake agreement that we have with the local motel or the local domestic violence and sexual assault program for working on these issues, and our champion leaves that particular area? Do we have policies and procedures in place? Do we have memorandums of understanding in place? Because especially in rural areas, we oftentimes have a huge changeover in staffing. And what happens when that key person leaves? Do we have things put in place that are going to still be there, right? If we're talking about identifying stalking in these rural areas and really making sure that we're providing accountability and safety options, we have to go beyond what the stereotypical definition of stalking is. It's always frustrating to me when we go to do a training for Spark and somebody develops a flyer for the training we're going to do in their area. And it's a picture of somebody who's dressed all in black, in a black hoodie, peering through the windows, looking into somebody's house. And they're like, come to the stalking training. Good effort. Not the image that we would want to use, because it just supports the idea that stalking is committed by strangers who are going to be looking through your window. And it doesn't necessarily encompass all the different ways that we see happen in stalking crimes, that the offender is accessing the victim. If you've seen a Spark training before, you've heard us talk about this particular framework that we refer to as the SLY framework. And the reason that we talk about this is that it encourages people to think beyond just a very narrow vision of what stalking is. And it really encompasses all the different tactics that happen in stalking cases, including things like surveillance, which, if anything's going to be identified, it's usually those tactics. Life invasion, where the offender is inserting themselves into either the private sphere physically, online, of the victim's life, where they're intimidating a victim and where they're interfering, usually through some kind of sabotage or attack. Now, this framework was developed by a researcher out of the University of Kentucky after speaking with thousands of individuals who have been stalked and trying to come up with a way to really encompass all the different tactics that were happening in these particular cases. And so when she came up with the SLY framework, the surveillance behavior is usually pretty familiar to people because that's what stereotypical type of stalking is. And because victims are a little bit more likely to identify that they're being stalked when they're experiencing this stuff. And that's where the offender is following them, they're watching them, they're monitoring their social media, they're engaging in proxy stalking where they use a third party. And that can be as easy as somebody wandering in, to the county clerk's office, making small talk with the clerks and being like, yeah, I saw Sharon's car here the other week. What was she up to this week? And even if somebody says, well, I can't really say, they also have confirmed that Sharon's car was just there, okay, especially in rural communities. So using that third party to gain information, sometimes that third party is intentionally providing the information, sometimes they're unintentionally providing information. Now, when this stuff's happening, victims are a little bit more likely to identify that they're being stalked, but they're still probably not going to use the word stalking. They might say things like, they won't leave me alone, they won't get over it, they have a hard time letting go. They might say things like, they're just being creepy. And as a system, we're more likely to push a case forward if it has surveillance behavior, usually because there's some type of evidence of it. So as law enforcement, as prosecutors, we're more likely to take these types of cases forward because we have some type of evidence of that surveillance behavior. And what the offender is also engaging in, however, is things like life invasion. So they're doing things like vandalizing the victim's property. They're showing up someplace. Some of you may have had instances where survivors tell you things like, I know that they've been in my house. Nothing's missing. There's no sign of a break-in. And in rural areas, maybe they don't even lock their doors, but I know that they've been here. And we're all like, okay, well, but how do we prove it, right? Or victims who are getting phone calls that are spoofed and saying, I know it's the offender calling, even though it's my daycare that's showing up on caller ID. And that life invasion is also oftentimes focused on things like intimidation, where the offender is threatening to harm themselves. They're engaging in things like symbolic violence. Now, symbolic violence is just when something happens that means absolutely nothing to anybody else, but it's symbolic for the victim. So it might be a certain gift, it might be a certain message, it might be a certain picture that the victim knows means something more than is at the surface level. We also have lots of offenders who might be engaging in some type of interference with the victim's job, with their reputation, which is very easy to happen in rural areas. Y'all know the latest rumor spreads in about 3.4 seconds, right? And they might also be threatening things like road rage or custody interference, etc. And the reason this framework is so helpful for those of you who are law enforcement, for those of you who are victim advocates, who are working on trying to establish that pattern to get a civil order of protection, or are working with a survivor before they go make a police report, oftentimes what happens is survivors come in reporting one particular thing. So say it's that this person, I think, slashed my tires. And what happens is the responding officer, those of us as victim advocates are like, okay, well, what else has been happening? And they're like, what do you mean what else? Like, isn't that enough? And we'll say, well, have other things like this happened before? And victims usually say, well, no. But if we change the way we're asking the question, and this isn't just me telling you this, research supports this, that if we say, instead of tell us about the other things that have been happening, or have there been other things that have been happening, or tell me about the other stalking behaviors, if we say things like, has this person been following you? Have they showed up unwanted at your job? Have they been having you check in? Do you think they're monitoring your social media? Have they been bugging your friends and family? Are they trying to interfere with custody? Then victims say, oh, yeah, all that's been happening. But they didn't identify it as stalking behavior. And we don't necessarily identify it as stalking behavior when it's brought up to us. And if we are trying to work on an issue that by its very definition requires a pattern of behavior, you can't establish a pattern unless you have more than one incident. And we have to change the way we're asking about those incidents. I'm going to ask Julia to link in the chat. We have lots of handouts on Spark's website that talk about this SLY framework and have specific questions to ask. Has this been happening? Has this been happening? And if some of you are thinking, well, that's not my role, I'm not trying to build the case, you're trying to safety plan. How are you safety planning if you don't know all the things that have been happening? That framework can be really helpful for us expanding our definition and the survivor that we're working with's definition of what stalking is. And all of those behaviors put together are oftentimes helping us establish a stalking crime. Because see, one of the difficulties with stalking crimes is that the individual incidents that happen in and of themselves are not crimes. It is not a criminal to send somebody a text message or show up at the local pancake feed. But it might become criminal if it's within the context of a stalking crime. And so how are we trying to establish and understand these behaviors in order to adequately safety plan? So Julia, thank you, Julia, is linking some of the resources that we have on that SLY framework on our website in the chat for you. The other thing that I want you to be thinking about is how are we identifying stalking as part of and separate from intimate partner violence? Now, most of us are on this call because we have a better background, training, understanding of what intimate partner violence is. And I'm going to guess many of us have seen this power and control wheel before that was put together decades ago that really tried to identify all the different tactics that happen in intimate partner violence cases. And I use this as an example to encourage you to think about this type of scenario. For me, it was the aha moment in my career. What if you have somebody come in who says that they're in a domestic violence relationship? You've established this, and they talk about how controlling that offender is and how they're always monitoring their social media, they're always showing up places, they don't like that they have a job, etc. And then they're also talking about things like they're really jealous, they intimidate other people, they've really tried to shrink my world to only them. Most of us are like, oh yeah, you know what? That's part of intimate partner violence. It's not just physical or sexual abuse. It's also things like this coercive control that happens. It's that power and control that happens in intimate partner violence. But is that monitoring of social media, that showing up at the gym, that making threats to the victim also a course of conduct directed at someone that would cause them to feel fear? And is probably also stalking behavior? Yeah. But the problem is, see, we never call it stalking until the victim breaks up with the offender. And then if the offender shows up at the work or is monitoring social media, then we might say, okay, well, now it's turned into stalking. It was stalking while it was happening within the context of domestic violence. We just didn't call it that. And some of you might be like, well, yeah, does it really matter what we call it, Jennifer? Like, we're still going to safety plan our jurisdictions a lot. I mean, we finally got our courts to address domestic violence. Let's not try to have them address stalking too. It's important to understand and name it for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's another criminal charge. But just as, if not more importantly, it's also important to safety plan. Because our intimate partner stalkers, the people who are committing domestic violence plus stalking, are some of our most dangerous. And in fact, in 85% of attempted and 76% of completed intimate partner femicides, where there has been a male who murdered a female intimate partner, there has been an episode of stalking within the year prior to the murder. But if we never identified it as separate from domestic violence, and we didn't safety plan around the specific risks posed by stalking behavior, we miss the opportunity. What we know is that stalking is one of the top lethality factors in intimate partner violence. How many of you have had training on domestic violence lethality, where they taught you things like strangulation? And yeah, lots of you. I'm going to be surprised if some of you haven't, but maybe you're newer to the work. But how many of you in that lethality training were taught that stalking was a lethality factor in intimate partner violence? A lot of times people miss it. What we actually know is that stalking is the number 8 risk factor in intimate partner violence. And in fact, if you have a situation where somebody is engaging in intimate partner violence as well as stalking behavior. You have a victim who is in 3 times greater danger of being killed by that offender. But if we never called it stalking, if we didn't charge it, if we didn't look at a safety plan around it, we missed that opportunity. Because many folks are concentrated on the other lethality factors that are listed up here, which is important. Don't ignore those. But also keep in mind that it's really important to identify the stalking behavior as separate from and in addition to intimate partner violence. Now, as we look at that then, and we're looking at those intimate partners and the increased risk of lethality, everybody always says to us, well, you know what? Absolutely, Jennifer, we get it in our DVs. We are always screening for stalking. And I'm like, that's awesome. Tell me what you ask. And they're like, well, we ask the victim if they're being stalked. Great intent. Wrong question. You can't just ask victims if they're being stalked because they have that stereotypical definition of what stalking is. Instead, if you ask things like, has this person been tracking, following, or monitoring you? Have they invaded your life or privacy by making unwanted content? Have they significantly and directly interfered with your life? Or have they on more than one occasion intimidated or threatened you? If you think about your domestic violence caseload right now and you looked at these questions and you started asking these of the survivors you're working with, how many of the survivors that you work with would answer yes to at least one of these questions? Most people are going to say all of them, most of them. Yeah. Which means you just screen them in that they're probably experiencing stalking. And why is that important? Because of all the specific risks that are associated with stalking. And in order to hold offenders accountable and increase safety for victims in these cases, we have to be able to identify that stalking behavior. And we have to be able to work together to build a coordinated response to that. And one of the things that I encourage you to be thinking about, and I would love to hear in the chat, regardless of whether your CCR is a formal CCR, whether it's a SART team, a sexual assault response team, or whether it's kind of an ad hoc team, like a team that is meeting but isn't necessarily a formal team. Are there creative additional members that you've added to your CCR team? Most CCR teams are really focused on what we call the big four, advocacy, law enforcement, courts, and medical professionals. But what about additional members? One of the additional members that we involved in very early on when we started talking about stalking within the context of our SART teams and our domestic violence CCR teams was that, and somebody's saying, does that mean in schools we have not just a bullying problem, but also a stalking problem? Yes. That's my short answer. Yes. As you look at those members, who are some of those maybe unique folks that you're including? And for us, one of our unique members was our Humane Society. In our jurisdiction, there wasn't a specific animal control or anything like that. We were way too rural. But our Humane Society were the folks who were responding and removing animals, et cetera. And very early on, I remember going to a domestic violence conference where the Humane Society was there because it was on the link between DV and animal abuse. And they were talking about the families in our jurisdiction. And they were like, oh yeah, we pulled another dog from so-and-so's and they should be banned from getting cats at such and such a place. And all of the individuals that they were talking about were involved with our local anti-violence program. And I was like, there's some overlap here. So some of you are talking about those particular individuals, libraries, et cetera, not meaning that those kind of fringe or ancillary members would be involved in like case planning or, discussing specific cases, et cetera. Oftentimes that's going to be limited to your core members, but how are they involved with building the response, with the prevention efforts, with coordinating, what kind of information is put out in your community, et cetera? Absolutely. As you're looking at your victim service providers, then are those victim service providers providing screening for stalking? Is that something that's being brought up in their interactions with survivors? Are those individuals who are safety planning able to identify the specific risks and safety issues that are posed by stalking? Do they know how to stalking safety plan? A lot of times when I ask people, so tell me what your stalking safety plan looks like, they say things like, well, we encourage the victim to get a dog and a Ring camera and, you know, make sure that somebody walks back and forth to them back and forth to their car after work. They focus a lot on the tactical safety planning. And it's not things about like, you know, who's supporting this survivor when they feel like they're losing their mind because the offender keeps showing up all these places. Who is working with a survivor to figure out, how am I eating? How am I sleeping? Can I access mental health services, etc.? Do we have advocates who are familiar with doing stalking specific risk assessment? Are they able to help with civil protection orders and know what a judge might be looking for in your stalking specific orders? Would they know what to do with a survivor who would qualify for both a DV and a stalking order and what the pros and cons are of going for one or the other? Would they know what kind of shelter supports are familiar? Across this country, and we have this conversation with federal funders. In fact, we just had it last January when we met with like OVC and OVW and people that give out money to shelter agencies all across the country. And we said, you know, people are telling us all the time that their funding doesn't cover shelter for victims of stalking. And one of the directors of one of those programs said, yeah, it does. I was like, well, then that needs to be communicated to the people who are getting the funding, because they're using that as a reason why survivors of stalking are not being provided with housing options. So what kind of options are available for victims of stalking? And how are we working with those survivors on documenting these incidents? A lot of times we have advocates who are working with survivors to be able to gather information before they go in to make a police report. And what happens a lot of times is really well-meaning individuals tell victims of stalking, well, keep a journal about everything that's been happening. Yes, stalking is covered under Title IX, as somebody was asking in the chat. And while a journal might be helpful in gathering some information, oftentimes a stalking incident log might be more helpful for law enforcement. So we actually have these on our website in English and in Spanish. And on one side is the exact log that you see on your screen. And on the other side are instructions for keeping the log, telling victims exactly what needs to be written there. And this can be really helpful to be able to have conversations with survivors about keeping some of this documentation in order to assist law enforcement in building a stalking case. We're never lucky enough that the stalker is actually still on scene when law enforcement shows up. They've always fled, and then we're trying to go backwards and gather information and evidence in these particular cases. And the survivor really is the person who has the best access. And so as Julia indicated in the chat, this documentation log is actually available in 10 languages on our website, and it can be really helpful for survivors to be able to keep this log as they're looking at bringing forward information to law enforcement, to their college campus, something like that. So definitely check it out. And Julia just linked it in the chat for me. Thank you, Julia. For those of you who are victim advocates, we would encourage you to join our Spark community of practice for advocacy folks. So this is a chance for you to get online and meet via Zoom with other advocates across the country who are working to increase safety in stalking cases. This is really beneficial for all of you who are in rural areas where you might be the only advocate. And we all know how beneficial it is to be able to staff ideas or bounce ideas off of other people. But if you don't have those people, especially because you're in a rural area, this can be a really great way of meeting other advocates. The other thing that we can be thinking about is what does that work and look like for the folks who are tasked with law enforcement. Okay, so for those of you who are police officers and sheriffs, how do we focus in on these investigations to make sure that we are encompassing not only intimate partner stalking investigations, but non-intimate partner stalking investigations? And are we identifying stalking as a co-occurring crime in things like domestic violence or sexual assault? Are we having somebody who's reviewing our calls for service, our call logs, to screen for stalking? One of the law enforcement agencies that we work with, it's in a rural area here in Idaho, initially said, you know, we don't we don't work with that many victims of stalking. And then they hired somebody to start going through their calls for service, and the calls that came into dispatch, and really analyzing them to see, were there stalking things that were being said, but not identified as stalking by the dispatchers or by the victim. And their reports went from like 3% of their reports including stalking to over like 30% of their reports including stalking, simply by going back through and realizing survivors aren't using that word, but this is a stalking incident. Would law enforcement be familiar with the specific threats that are posed by a stalking offender? Would they know what type of risk assessment to be able to do? One of the things I ask lots of law enforcement officers is when you arrest someone for a violation of a civil protection order, do you also look at stalking? And is the prosecutor charging stalking as part of that violation of the civil protection order? Is that not a course of conduct directed at somebody that would cause them to feel fear? And if there's a civil protection order in place, usually the stalking elevates from a misdemeanor to a felony. It's a second charge that's overlooked all the time. As we're looking at that law enforcement response, we have an entire section on our website for those of you who are law enforcement to be able to identify stalking on calls for service. Lacey talked about the fact that we did a stalking roll call training with ICCR, and so we have those available on the website. The SPY framework for using as a checklist to ask in stalking cases is also available on the website. So Julie is linking all the resources that are specific to law enforcement there. We also do training specific to law enforcement. We spend lots of time going into jurisdictions across the country. I know Lacey's also going to highlight the fact that we're going to be doing an in-person training at Genesis and CCAW's in-person training site at the end of February. So she'll highlight that a little bit for us at the end of today as well. The other thing that we want to look at is, do you have a model policy on stalking for law enforcement? Many of you have a policy on DV, you have a policy on sexual assault. How are you making sure, if you're on this webinar, you're one of the champions, okay, you're already bringing forth the issue, and thank you for being on it. But what happens when you leave? How do you make sure that other people who come up in your footsteps are also paying attention to this issue? And the best way to do that is to make sure you have a policy on stalking. This is also a really good way to make sure that your checks and balances are in place, because when the defense attorney asks you on the stand, well, why did you respond this particular way to the stalking crime? You say, it's based on our policies and procedures, just like you do all the time, based on my training and experience. Okay, we have a model policy on our website that you can adapt. You don't have to start at square one. There were a few prosecutors on here as well. So Spark actually sits in a larger organization called Equitas, which is geared towards really enhancing prosecution response, all responses, but particularly prosecution. And we have resources on our website specific for prosecutors as well. So that same dynamic of thinking about, are you charging civil protection orders or domestic violence, co-charging things like stalking? One of the reasons to do so, and thinking about it, and those of you who are law enforcement, listen closely as well, if you are on a domestic violence incident and you've brought stuff forward, you may have heard your prosecutor say things like, well, that's a prior bad act. I can't get that in front of the judge unless I jump through some hoops to try to include that prior bad act, because that was an incident that happened 3 months ago. If you charge stalking in addition to the domestic violence, you can go back to the very first incident that happened in the stalking course of conduct. And now you can charge all of the incidents that have happened since then, and you're not limited and have to go through the same hoops to include some of that, what we call 404B evidence. So keep in mind that you might be able to be strategic in including stalking in the charge there as well. Are you looking at using expert testimony in stalking cases? If you use it in domestic violence cases, chances are the people who do your DV expert witness testimony could also do stalking expert witness testimony. Are you looking at things like forfeiture by wrongdoing, which is when the offender has done something that causes the victim to not show up for court? Are we looking at that as a possibility of accountability for stalking offenders? All of that's outlined in our prosecutor's guide to addressing stalking, as well as for those of you who are part of probation and parole. What does that look like? Do you have a specialized caseload for stalking offenders? Are you identifying stalking as part of the course of conduct in these particular situations? And we've got a guide for probation and parole. For those of you that are part of that system, is somebody making contact with victims? Are we conducting risk assessments? Are we having frequent field contacts with those individuals? Are we looking at pretrial services that same like we might for domestic violence or sexual assault in some of these areas? And all of these are included in some of the resources on our website. So I just want to highlight those for you all. Some of the things that we talked about. We also have guides for judges. We have guides for individuals who might be working directly with survivors in the capacity as systems-based advocates, et cetera. And I also want to talk a little bit about medical professionals, because medical professionals have a tendency to be included in DV and sexual assault response teams, but they sometimes are ignored when it comes to stalking. And I want you to think about your jurisdiction and where it is that survivors might access services. And I always am adamant that we need to be making sure that we are including medical professionals, both physical health and mental health professionals, because it's one thing for me to ignore that maybe I need to go make a police report. That's scary, and I want to go talk to law enforcement. I don't want to go to a domestic violence or sexual assault agency, but it's really difficult to ignore your medical health needs. And a lot of times survivors are accessing assistance at the doctor's office, at the WIC program, at family planning clinic, something like that. And those individuals are receiving disclosures, but they know what to do with them. I'll give you an example. When this is a long time ago because my kids are young adults now, but when I had my first daughter, we had trained the local hospital on how to identify domestic violence. And so when they did my domestic violence screening, I was in labor, hadn't had my pain meds yet, and my husband was sitting there holding my hand when they did my domestic violence screening. And I was like, oh boy. So I had some conversations after I birthed my first daughter with that hospital, and I was like, let's think about what's going to happen going forward. And then when I had my second daughter, they asked me screening questions. They called me on the phone. They asked if I was safe. I was able to ask these questions, and I'm thinking, oh yes, awesome, great screening process. And then at the very end of the screening process, and I said thank you to the person for asking the screening questions, she says, well, I'm really glad that everybody says no, because I wouldn't know what to do if somebody said yes to the screening questions. Fail. So are these folks screening, and would they know what to do with disclosures? Yeah. As somebody said in the chat, womp womp. Okay. So I want you to think about this question. Is your agency or jurisdiction working with stalking victims? And if so, which stalking victims? And how are those rural areas contributing to the barriers that these stalking victims face? I'd love to hear some of your answers in the chat. I want to make sure I actually give a chance for people to respond. So either everybody has disengaged. Okay, here's kind of some answers. Okay. Some people are saying absolutely. Others are saying, I think it might be a lack of training, or yeah, we're doing it and we don't have a relationship requirement, which is awesome. And then they think, it might be contributing to the fact that maybe people don't understand what stalking is. And so that can be part of the issues. One of the things that I would encourage you all to be thinking about right now is how can you capitalize on the month of January, which is Stalking Awareness Month, to be able to start the conversation in your community, and thinking about what kind of message does that send to survivors when you're talking about stalking, and pushing out information. And as you're doing that and building your coordinated response, one of the things that we would encourage you to be thinking about is not only those individual pieces that we just talked about, but then how are we all working together? And I always use this graphic of like a puzzle piece, and there are intentionally blank pieces on here because I don't know your community as well as you do. There are people who are going to fit into this blank puzzle piece that might not be relevant to every community, but are certainly relevant to your community. And as you're looking at those strategies, really identifying that we need to focus on risk. And I've brought up risk a couple of times, and I want to also highlight for you what a stalking specific risk assessment looks like. But also making sure that we are developing internally for ourselves. So I always say do intra agency training and then do inter-agency training, meaning train your own folks first, okay? And then work on training one another. And what does that look like? And do you have policies and procedures in place? And Julia's linked a couple of things in the chat. We also have available on Spark's website, there's a training button. So if you want training, you just click on it and request your training with us. Okay, a lot of times we'll do virtual training. We do in-person training as well. Like I said, Lacey's going to highlight the fact that we're going to be doing an in-person training available to anybody who wants to come the end of February down at their training center. I love that folks are saying we staff cases with law enforcement and judges and safety plan. Love that idea. That's so important in making sure that our survivors are supported during that process. We know that survivors of stalking and really any type of gender-based violence, if they are supported through the process, they are happier with the outcome of their case, regardless what the outcome is. So saying it another way is if somebody receives a conviction in their stalking case, they aren't as happy with the outcome if they weren't supported as they would be with the outcome if they were supported, but they didn't get the conviction. So I always tell people you can't control what the system does, but you absolutely can control the way that you interact with survivors during the process. And so making sure that we are doing things that are really looking to hold offenders accountable in these cases. Are we approaching stalking as homicide prevention? I 1000% believe that it is. And are we maintaining records that help us do so? Are we doing risk assessment? Are we identifying the risk in stalking cases that's separate from the risk posed by domestic violence? I have some jurisdictions who are like, oh, we're doing stalking risk assessment, Jennifer. I'm like, oh, awesome. Tell me what you're using. And they're like, oh, we're using the danger assessment by Jacqueline Campbell, or we're using the Maryland lethality assessment protocol. And I'm like, for all stalking cases? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, including acquaintance stalking cases? And they say yes. And I'm like, they're DV assessments. You can't use them in an acquaintance situation. What we encourage you to do is if you are using a intimate partner violence assessment, like the LAP, like the danger assessment, ODARA, appraise, for those of you that are in Arizona, the questions that are looking at controlling and jealous behavior, following or spying, destroying property, or obsession with the victim are all typically looking at stalking behavior. And if the victim answers yes to those, then perhaps we should also be thinking about doing a stalking specific risk assessment. And the other thing is, if you are working on an acquaintance stalking case, doing a stalking risk assessment is really important. This is the risk assessment that we encourage people to check out. It's available for free. It doesn't cost any money. I know my rural people. I know none of you have budgets. I get it. If you go to coercivecontrol.org or stalkingrisk.com, you can fill out this assessment online. It is a series of questions that look at 14 different risk factors in stalking cases. And it ends up generating not only a risk profile, but an accompanying safety plan as well. And before, Maria just asked, is it available in Spanish? It is not, Maria. So when we've had opportunities to do risk assessment with survivors who speak Spanish, we have an advocate or someone else who is translating or interpreting what's going on and translating the materials back and forth. It's a little bit more difficult to just make it available in Spanish than it sounds, because there's a lot of nuances and programming that goes in with it. And Dr. Logan, who's the person who came up with the slide framework, came up with this assessment as well. And she hasn't had the funding to launch it in other languages. And it's just a lot more complicated, but definitely have the questions for you available in a Word printout that you could use as well. So thinking about if you use a SHARP assessment, one of the things that it does is identify the unique risks that are posed in stalking situations. And so it essentially goes over 14 risk factors in stalking cases, including looking at things like what type of behavior has been happening. Do we have a relationship with the offender? What's the offender's motivation? Do we have a victim who might be vulnerable because of language access, because of the fact that they share custody with the offender? Do we have an offender who has access to weapons? Do we have somebody who has been previously engaged in a relationship with this person? So those websites again, Caleb, are coercivecontrol.org that you see on your screen right in front of you for this one, or if you go to stalkingrisk.com, both of those bring those up. I would encourage all of you to go through an assessment first by yourself. Think about a case that you've worked on, see what kind of information it gives you. You'll become more familiar and comfortable with the assessment. We don't encourage you to say to a survivor, oh, go back and take the assessment, because it's traumatizing and it can be really hard for a victim. Plus, it might not be safe for them to do it on their own computer. So if you have the opportunity, get on this particular assessment, and Julia, again, is linking information in the chat. Thanks, Julia. The other thing that I would encourage you all to be thinking about then is, as you're becoming more familiar with the risk factors in stalking cases, those things that I mentioned, you know, the history, the vulnerability, the access, etc., that also allows you to get better at safety planning. And the thing that I really like about SHARP is when you do the assessment, it not only gives you the risk assessment and the risk profile, but it also gives you an accompanying safety plan that's specific to that case. And you're all excellent at safety planning. This is just another boost, things for you to be thinking about, etc. And it's a really great way to have a conversation with survivors, especially survivors who might be minimizing the risk. It's a really great thing to use in a coordinated response where you're trying to really kind of all get on the same page about what's happening in this particular case. And like I said, it's free to use, and then it downloads both the risk assessment and the safety plan in like a Microsoft Word document that you can print out and give to the survivor, et cetera. So if you're not familiar with it, we do have recorded webinars on our site that kind of walk you through it. If you attend any of our in-person training events, we typically go through a risk assessment with you and talk about all the different risks that are posed in these particular cases. And the other thing that I want to highlight is just the unique thing that happens in lots of rural areas, which is firearm ownership. I've disclosed to you that I live in Idaho, where folks are born, they get a gun, they turn 7, they get another gun, they turn 14, they get a third one. So firearms are a unique aspect in consideration here in Idaho, both in our domestic violence cases as well in our stalking cases. And one of the things that oftentimes happens is when we're working to safety plan with a survivor, or we're looking at, you know, is a civil protection order going to be served? Is law enforcement going to go out and try to make an arrest? Lots of survivors will say things like they have a gun. And then we're like, handgun, rifle, shotgun. And many survivors are like, what's the difference? This is a handout that was developed in a rural jurisdiction of Pitt County, North Carolina, by a good friend of mine, Chief John Gard at the Pitt County Sheriff's Office. And he developed this because it became such an issue in a lot of their cases that they would supply this to the survivors that were they were working with to be able to identify what kind of firearms were present, so that if they were taking firearms when they served a protection order, if they were responding and law enforcement simply needed to know what's at the other end of the 150-foot lane, it would be nice to know if it's a rifle or if it's a handgun. This information was really helpful to them. So an example of some of the things that can be used and adapted in rural areas that can be really beneficial when you're looking at the risk posed in stalking cases. And then as we're building that accountability, really making sure that we're working together to focus on accountability of civil protection orders being upheld, of being served, of monitoring the enforcement of those civil protection orders, as well as making sure that we are providing a consistent message with victims about and offenders about the fact that this behavior is unacceptable. You deserve better than this. We're not going to tolerate it as a community, and that this person's going to be held accountable for individuals the individuals who are engaging in this type of behavior. Tara, if you want to send me an email, you'll see my email at the end of the presentation. I can send you the firearm identification tool with kudos to Pitt County. So then for those of us that are really looking at safety planning with victims, keeping in mind that oftentimes, especially for stalking survivors, our first contact with them makes or breaks whether they're going to tell anybody else. And in a lot of stalking situations, what happens is victims say to us, and we hear things like, so I have to wait till this person hurts me before anybody's going to do anything? Because that's the way it feels. And as we're looking at building cases like this, trying to think about the safety options, the advocacy and documentation, as well as, and folks, please don't put your email in there for us to send it to you. There's almost 500 of you on here. It's going to be easier if you reach out to us first, because we're not going to be able to track all of these that are popping up in the chat. So please reach out to us. So just want to flag that for you, Anita, because it will be difficult for us to go back through. So send us an email. As you look at these particular situations, one of the things that oftentimes happens in stalking cases is everybody thinks that the way to solve the stalking case is to simply tell the victim to stop making contact with the offender or to unplug if they're on some type of social media. And while disengagement is ideal, it's not always very practical. What we know oftentimes happens in these cases is victims are reluctant to have anybody contact the stalker, to have to actually pull away from the stalker and not engage with the stalker because they're afraid it's going to make things worse. And one of the things that I always encourage people to think about is, everybody says to a victim who's getting a bunch of text messages or phone calls, well, change your phone number. But if you're working with somebody and the victim's being stalked and the offender calls and gets the, I'm sorry, this number has been disconnected, does the stalking offender just give up? Are they like, oh, darn, they disconnected their number, I guess I'm done stalking them? How ridiculous does that sound, right? But we do it all the time. And maybe it's not per phone number, but everybody says, well, if they're contacting you off Facebook, just get off Facebook. Because the offender would be like, oh, darn, they're not on Facebook anymore. It's not like I don't know where they live, where their parents live, which ranches theirs, and which bar they hang out on. Okay. A lot of survivors, as was said in the chat, say, hey, at least if I'm in contact, I know what's up. It's a temperature check. And especially in intimate partner situations, if they've been making contact, they know what to think. They know what the offender is thinking at this particular moment in time. And if they're an intimate partner offender, they've spent years trying to talk this person down and they've been successful because they're still alive. So don't look at the fact that you have a victim of stalking who's engaging with the offender as oh, it's not that serious, they can't be that scared. It's so serious that they're scared. Okay. Yeah, exactly as Lace put in there, the shark fin theory, right? So keeping in mind that a lot of times victims of stalking's attempts to distance themselves from the stalker frustrate the stalker. And that might increase the level of risk. Okay. The other thing we want to be thinking about is, as we're safety planning, really making sure that we're putting victims in contact with tangible resources. So if you're the domestic violence and sexual assault agency, there's not a counseling agency in town, there isn't a health clinic in town, what kind of resources are available to access? Is there telehealth options? Is there a therapist who's willing to do, services or appointments via telehealth? Are they willing to come to your office to be able to do counseling appointments, et cetera, et cetera? As you're looking at those particular things and really trying to creatively think about all the things that we talked about earlier about how hard it is for victims of stalking, especially in rural areas, to access services and to access help, and making sure that we are trusting victims' instincts. I have people say to me all the time, well, how do I know what's going to happen with a civil protection order? Like, how do we know if the offender is going to actually, listen to the civil protection order, or what they're going to do if they're arrested? And I'm always like, ask the victim. Like, they're an expert on the offender's behavior. Okay. The problem is, especially in rural areas, victims are always trying to balance their freedom with their safety. So if I'm trying to stay safe and there's only one grocery store in town and there's only one gas station and there's only one place to go out to eat, then everybody expects me to avoid those places. And that's not practical. It doesn't allow victims to live in their freedom and be able to go places. And so how are we flipping that narrative and looking at accountability instead? And victims are always struggling with how to balance that freedom and safety element. And as we are working with them, those resources that I highlighted earlier might give you some ideas and suggestions on ways to improve your response in these particular cases. And I know that all of you are extremely good at your job. And I know you're passionate about this issue or you wouldn't be on this webinar. So please don't take this as a we think you're doing everything wrong, but rather here's some thoughts and suggestions for how you continue to do an even better job and make sure that you're serving even more survivors when it comes to also encompassing stalking survivors in the work that you're doing. I mentioned a couple of times that this month is Stalking Awareness Month. Next week, we are going to provide an award to a service provider who is working to engage the community. And it's an award we call the Peggy Klinke Award. And this award is named for a victim of stalking who was murdered by her stalker. And her sister is actually the founder of Stalking Awareness Month. Stalking Awareness Month is held in the month of January because Peggy, who was the stalking victim, was killed by the stalking offender in her case. And so her sister Debbie went forward to try to encourage the nation as a whole to improve their ability to be able to identify and respond to stalking cases. And every year in January, we have a National Day of Action. So this might be something that you promote in your community to increase that awareness and understanding of what stalking is. And it's a National Day of Action that we do on January 18th. It's for stalking awareness. And one of the things that Debbie says about Peggy is that as Peggy was in that relationship with Patrick, and he became more and more controlling and he began to stalk her, that they really saw her sparkling, vibrant personality disappear. And so on the 18th, we encourage a day of action to bring back the sparkle for Peggy and for all survivors of stalking. And we have a ton of information on our website about engaging in the month of January to promote awareness. We have social media posts that you can use. We have proclamations. We have all these things that you can use. We've tried to make it as easy as possible for you. And I know that Julia will link in the chat some of the things that you can do, as well as the day of action, thanks Julia, for January, so that we would encourage all of you, start the dialogue now. It's a really easy way because it's January, use it as an excuse to be able to promote stalking awareness in your community. And if you want to access those resources and other resources that we've talked about today, please check out our website, which is stalkingawareness.org. Everything that you see on there, you can use for free. There are guides for all of you, all the disciplines that we talked about. There are workshops that you can conduct in your community. If you have to do public awareness workshops and you're like, oh, I've never done one on stalking before, don't reinvent the wheel, just download ours. There's the PowerPoints there. There's things like a Spotify playlist on stalking, et cetera, a bunch of really great ideas. And Julie is linking some of the information in the chat for you all to be able to use during this month. So this is my contact information. Please, if you email us, be kind to us during the month of January. We're responsible for creating awareness for the entire country, and we have a robust staff of 6 people. So please be sure that if you email us, know that it might take a little bit of a hot second for us to respond to you, just because we're a little busy this month, but that we will certainly be in contact with you. But a lot of the information you can find available on our website. All right, so Lacey, I'm going to stop and kick it back to you. I'm going to end our share here and then let you say what you want to say about any upcoming events. Of course, it's not letting me end my share. Hold on. My computer's taking a hot second.
Yeah.
It's like, it doesn't want to stop. It wants everyone to see all the information all the time. That's the issue. We'll see if it'll stop here in just a second, but I'll let you go on while I'm trying to,
About
unless,
5 minutes if anyone has.
yeah. There we go. Now it's happy.
There we go. Yeah, we have about 5 minutes if anyone has any questions, last minute questions to put in the chat. But I will go ahead and share my screen because you did mention a couple times we do have an in-person training coming up on February the 25th. And so it is in person. If you are around Dallas or can get to Dallas easily, we'd love for you to come. Jennifer will be there along with Denise Jones, who is law enforcement officer out of Ohio. Is she in Ohio?
Yes. Yep. She's in Clark County, Ohio.
That's yeah. And we love Denise. She's also been a friend of the conference for many years as well. So a registration is going to open next Tuesday. And you can find that on our training center, National Training Center on Crimes Against Women website, trainingsdaw.org. So please come to Dallas and have a whole day with Jennifer and Denise. I promise it'll be fun. And then if you have never been to our conference before, it is also a really good time. You can ask Jennifer. We always have fun at Howdy Hour. We do hard work, so we need to play hard when we can as well. So the Conference on Crimes Against Women, our 20th annual conference is going to be May 19th through the 22nd. Also in Dallas. Registration is open now. And please join us. And there's our contact information as well if anybody would like to get a hold of us. So I did not see, all I said was wonderful, and all I see is lots of good stuff. No questions. There's a question about a survey. Yes, you will receive a survey that will pop up as soon as you close Zoom, and it has a link then once you complete the survey to your certificate for attending today. And so lots of great information, and
Thanks,
everybody promote Stalking Awareness Day on January 18th. So thanks for being here. All right, take care. Bye.